In the high country of Colorado's San Juan Valley, where the wind carries both promise and heartache, a pregnant woman builds her future, one stone at a time. Clara Whitcomb's calloused hands work steadily, placing each sandstone block with the determination of someone who has lost everything and refuses to lose again. Her hammer strikes echo across the valley like a prayer, each blow a testament to starting over at 39 with nothing but hope and the child growing within her. Down the slope, widower Silas Boone pauses in his fence mending, drawn by the rhythm of her work and the soft hymn she hums between breaths. At 61, he thought his chance for family had passed with his wife's grave. But something about Clara's stubborn courage stirs memories of what home could mean. When will two hearts, weathered by loss, discover that the shelter they're building is meant for both of them? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the rim of Colorado's San Juan Valley, as Clara Whitcomb hefted another sandstone block from the creek bed below her building site. 6 months along now, her belly made the work harder, but not impossible. She'd learned long ago that impossible was just another word for things that took longer to figure out. Her bare ring finger caught the light as she positioned the stone against its neighbor. 3 years since, she'd slipped off her wedding band and buried it with Thomas beneath the cottonwoods outside Durango. 3 years of drifting from camp to camp, following whatever work would have her cooking for surveying crews, tending sick children in mining settlements, mending clothes for railroad gangs. Always moving, never settling, until the baby growing inside her demanded something more permanent than a tent and the promise of tomorrow's wages. She'd chosen this spot for its water and timber, but mostly for its distance from everything that reminded her of what she'd lost. The land claim cost her the last of her savings, but it came with mineral rights and a creek that ran year-round. More importantly, it came with silence the kind that let a woman think without the weight of other people's expectations pressing down on her shoulders. Clara straightened slowly, one hand pressed against the small of her back. The cabin's foundation was taking shape, though slower than she'd hoped. Winter would come early at this elevation, and the baby was due before the first heavy snows. She'd calculated and recalculated the timeline, factoring in her diminishing mobility and the mountain weather's unpredictability. There was enough time if she kept working steady and nothing went wrong. She picked up her mortar trowel, mixing the lime and sand with practiced efficiency. The rhythm soothed her scrape, spread, place, level. Each stone fitted perfectly against the next, creating something solid from scattered pieces. It reminded her of the way Thomas used to describe their marriage. Two people from different worlds, finding the places where they fit together naturally. Thomas had been a gentleman, better suited to books than the rough country that eventually claimed him. He'd followed her west from Missouri because she'd dreamed of land and space, but the altitude and harsh winters had worn him down year by year. When the fever took him, she'd blamed herself for wanting more than what they'd had back home. Now, carrying his child and building her own shelter, she wondered if this was what he'd have wanted for her, this fierce independence, this determination to make something lasting from the remnants of their shared dreams. She hummed an old hymn her mother had taught her, the same one she'd sung to Thomas during his final weeks. The melody drifted across the valley, mixing with the sound of her hammer and the whisper of wind through the pine trees. Down the slope, past the stand of aspen that marked the boundary between properties, Silas Boone heard that hymn and paused in his fence repair. He'd been hearing it for weeks now, carried on the morning air like a promise of something he couldn't quite name. The woman building up there had a clear, sweet voice that made him think of church services and Sunday dinners, of the kind of home he'd once known and lost. Silas was a man shaped by solitude and hard work. At 61, his hair had gone silver at the temples, and his hands bore the scars of 30 years managing cattle in country that didn't forgive mistakes. He'd taken the job overseeing the Morrison ranch after his wife died, partly for the steady wages, but mostly for the isolation. The owners lived back east and visited rarely, leaving him to tend 2,000 acres of high pasture with only the cattle and his own thoughts for company. He'd noticed the newcomer the day she'd arrived with her wagon and surveying equipment, watched her pace off the boundaries of her claim with the methodical patience of someone who'd done such work before. She moved with purpose, even heavy with child, and there was something in her bearing that spoke of resilience rather than desperation. He'd seen plenty of both in his years, and the difference mattered. The Morrison place ran right up against her southern boundary, separated by a dry creek bed that filled with snowmelt in spring but ran clear most of the year. From his usual work sites, he could see her progress the gradual rise of stone walls, the careful placement of window frames, the slow transformation of bare ground into the foundation of a home. He found himself timing his morning chores to coincide with the sound of her voice, though he told himself it was mere coincidence. The fence line needed constant attention in this country, with its freeze-thaw cycles and wildlife traffic. If his repairs happened to take place within hearing distance of her singing, that was just efficient planning. Silas had been married for 28 years to Margaret, who'd followed him from ranch to ranch until they'd finally settled at Morrison's. She'd made each temporary bunkhouse into a home with her quilts and cooking, her flower gardens planted in old coffee tins, her gentle insistence that Sunday was for rest and reflection. When the cancer took her 5 years ago, he'd thought his life was essentially over, that whatever happiness he'd been allotted was finished, and all that remained was the daily routine of caring for livestock and property that belonged to someone else. But something about the pregnant woman's steady work, her quiet hymns, and her obvious determination to build something lasting had awakened feelings he'd thought were buried with Margaret. Not romantic feelings, exactly not yet, but a recognition of shared understanding. They were both people who knew what it meant to lose everything and still find the strength to begin again. He watched her struggle with a heavy roof beam one morning, saw how she had to rest between attempts to lift it into position. The sight made his chest tight with concern, though he stayed at his distance. A woman building alone was making a statement about her independence, and he respected that. But independence was one thing, and foolish risk was another. The valley spread out around them like a green bowl, rimmed with peaks that caught snow, even in summer. Wildlife moved through regularly: deer, elk, the occasional bear, or mountain lion. It was beautiful country, but unforgiving to those who didn't understand its moods. Winter storms could drop 6 feet of snow in 24 hours, and spring floods could wash out roads for weeks. The nearest neighbors were 15 miles down the mountain, the nearest doctor 25 miles in good weather. For a woman alone, especially one expecting a child, the isolation could turn dangerous quickly. But she seemed to understand the risks, seemed prepared for them in ways that spoke of experience with hard country and harder choices. Still, Silas found himself checking the weather signs more carefully, paying attention to the seasonal changes that would affect her timeline. He finished splicing the broken fence wire and gathered his tools, listening for the sound of her hammer. When it stopped, replaced by the softer scraping of mortar work, he allowed himself a small smile. She was making steady progress, despite the challenges. The cabin would be finished before winter if she kept working at this pace. As he loaded his tools into the back of his pickup truck, Silas caught sight of her walking to the creek for water, moving carefully over the uneven ground. She'd tied her dark hair back with a strip of cloth, and her work dress was dust-covered but clean. Even from this distance, he could see the pride in her posture, the satisfaction of someone who'd accomplished meaningful work with her own hands. He started the truck and began the drive back to the ranch house, but found himself thinking about the woman on the hill. She'd need help soon, whether she wanted to admit it or not. The question was how to offer it without insulting her obvious need for independence, without making her feel like he was trying to intrude on the life she was building for herself and her child. That evening, as he sat on his porch with his coffee and watched the last light fade from the peaks, Silas heard her voice again, carried on the still air. She was singing a lullaby this time, something soft and wordless that made him think of hope and new beginnings. For the first time in years, he found himself wondering what it might be like to have someone to sing to again, someone who needed the kind of steady presence he'd always been good at providing. The thought both frightened and comforted him. At 61, he'd assumed his chance for family had passed. But listening to that voice in the gathering darkness, he wondered if maybe life had surprises left for those patient enough to wait for them. The hand-carved wooden beam lay across two sawhorses like a bridge to nowhere, its weight seemingly manageable until Clara tried to lift it alone. She'd measured twice, cut once, and carved the notches that would seat it perfectly against the cabin's rising walls. But at 7 months pregnant, her center of gravity had shifted in ways that made familiar tasks suddenly treacherous. She wrapped her arms around the beam's middle, testing its heft. The pine was green and heavy with sap, probably 60 pounds of timber that needed to rise 8 feet to its proper place. Under normal circumstances, she'd have used a block and tackle, but the pulley system required anchor points she hadn't installed yet. Time was pressing, the weather had turned, and each day brought the possibility of an early storm that could delay construction for weeks. Clara bent her knees and lifted, feeling the beam's weight settle into her shoulders and back. For a moment, she had it controlled, moving steadily toward the wall where it belonged. Then her foot caught on a loose stone, and she stumbled forward, the beam's momentum carrying her toward the sharp corner of the foundation wall. "Ma'am, hold on there." The voice came from behind her, calm and unhurried. Strong hands caught the beam's far end, taking most of its weight before she could lose control completely. Clara found herself looking into the weathered face of the man she'd seen, working the fence line below silver hair, beneath a worn hat. Blue eyes that seemed to take in everything without judgment. "Easy now," he said, helping her guide the beam safely to the ground. "Let's set this down before somebody gets hurt." Clara stepped back, her heart hammering not just from the physical exertion, but from the sudden presence of another person in her carefully ordered solitude. She'd been alone for so long that even helpful strangers made her defensive. "I had it under control," she said, though they both knew that wasn't true. "I'm sure you did." He removed his hat, revealing hair that was mostly silver but still thick. "Silas Boone. I manage the Morrison place down the hill." "Clara Whitcomb." She wiped her dusty hands on her apron, conscious of how she must look sweaty, disheveled, obviously struggling with work that should have been simple. "I appreciate the help, but I can manage." "I'm sure you can." He looked at the beam, then at the walls of her cabin, taking in the careful stonework and precise measurements. "You've got good hands for this kind of work. Foundations square and level, joints are tight. You learn construction somewhere, or just pick it up as you go." The question caught her off guard. Most men who offered help did so, with the assumption that she was in over her head, that building was men's work, and she was playing at something beyond her capabilities. But Silas spoke as if he recognized skill when he saw it. "My father was a carpenter back in Missouri," she said, relaxing slightly. "He taught me to read wood grain and use tools properly. Said a person who could build something lasting would never want for work or shelter." "Smart man." Silas examined the beam more closely, running his fingers along the carved notches. "This is nice work. Joints like this will hold for 100 years if the wood's seasoned right." "The pine's green," Clara admitted. "I couldn't wait for it to dry proper. The baby's due in 2 months, and I need walls and a roof before then." Silas nodded, understanding the pressure she was under. "Green wood's not ideal, but it'll work if you account for the shrinkage. Might want to leave a little extra room in your joints, let the timber settle without binding." They stood there in the mountain silence, two people who'd been working alone, suddenly finding themselves in conversation. Clara felt the strange mixture of relief and anxiety that came with human contact after extended solitude. Part of her wanted to continue talking, to share the burden of her timeline and her worries. But another part, the part that had learned to protect it, wanted him to leave so she could return to the safety of her own company. "I should let you get back to your work," Silas said, seeming to sense her internal conflict. "But if you don't mind me saying, lifting beams that size alone isn't just difficult, it's dangerous. For you and the baby both." Clara's defenses rose immediately. "I've been taking care of myself for quite some time, Mr. Boone." "I'm sure you have." His tone remained gentle, non-confrontational. "And I'm not suggesting you can't, but even the most capable carpenter uses help when the job requires it. No shame in that." He gestured toward the beam. "This one here needs to be set exactly right, or your whole roof line will be off. It's a two-person job, under the best circumstances. With your condition, trying to do it alone is asking for trouble." Clara wanted to argue, but the logic was undeniable. She'd been dreading this moment, the point where her pregnancy made certain tasks impossible to complete safely. She'd hoped to finish the heavy work before reaching that stage, but the timeline had compressed faster than she'd anticipated. "I suppose I could wait for it to dry some more," she said, though they both knew she couldn't afford the delay. "Or you could let me give you a hand with it," Silas offered. "I've got some experience with construction, and I'm not doing anything that can't wait an hour or two." The offer hung between them like the beam itself, heavy with implications. Accepting help meant acknowledging her limitations, admitting that her fierce independence had practical boundaries. But refusing it meant risking injury to herself and her child, possibly delaying the cabin's completion past the point where it would provide adequate shelter. "I don't have money to pay for help," Clara said finally. "Didn't ask for any." Silas picked up one end of the beam, testing its balance. "Good neighbors help each other. That's how people survive in country like this." Clara studied his face, looking for signs of the patronizing attitude she'd encountered from men who thought pregnant women were helpless. But Silas seemed genuinely interested in the work itself, the problem-solving aspect of construction that she'd always found satisfying. "All right," she said. "But I do the measuring and placement. It's my cabin, and I know how I want it built." "Wouldn't have it any other way." Silas moved to the beam's other end. "You tell me where it goes, and I'll help you get it there." Working together, they lifted the beam smoothly, Clara guiding it into position while Silas provided the strength she lacked. The notches seated perfectly against the wall plates, creating a solid foundation for the roof structure that would follow. "That's good work," Silas said, stepping back to admire the result. "Fits like it was made for the spot." It was. Clara felt a flush of pride and accomplishment. The beam represented a crucial milestone, the point where her cabin began to look like an actual building rather than just a foundation with hopes attached. "You've got more of these to set?" Silas asked, noting the additional timbers stacked nearby. 5 more for the main supports, then the crossbeams and rafters. Clara calculated the work remaining. "I'd hoped to have the frame finished by week's end." "That's ambitious for one person." Silas examined the other beams, mentally estimating their weight and complexity, but doable with a little help. The suggestion was implicit but clear. Clara felt torn between gratitude and the fear of becoming dependent on someone she barely knew. She'd learned to be suspicious of offers that seemed too generous, too convenient. "Why would you want to help?" she asked bluntly. "You don't know me. I could be anyone, a thief, a troublemaker, someone who brings problems to quiet places." Silas considered the question seriously. "I suppose you could be, but I've been watching you work for weeks now, and I've seen how you handle yourself. Someone who builds the way you do, careful, methodical, taking pride in doing things right, that person's not likely to be a troublemaker." "You've been watching me?" Clara's voice carried a note of alarm. "Not watching like that," Silas said quickly. "But sound carries in this valley, and I work the fence line most mornings. I hear you singing, see you moving around your building site. Hard not to notice someone working that steady, that determined." Clara relaxed slightly. The explanation made sense, and his manner suggested observation born of neighborly interest rather than anything more intrusive. "I sing while I work," she said. "Habit from childhood. My mother always said it made hard work go easier." She was right about that. Silas smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. "My wife used to hum while she cooked, made the whole house feel warmer somehow." The past tense registered with Clara, adding another layer to her understanding of this man who'd appeared when she needed help most. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you." It's been 5 years now, but I still miss her voice around the place. Silas looked toward the valley below, where his ranch house sat among the cottonwoods. Gets quiet, living alone. Your singing reminds me that there's still life happening in the world. The honesty of his statement caught Clara off guard. She'd assumed her isolation was complete, that her daily routines went unnoticed by anyone. The idea that her voice had provided comfort to someone else, even unknowingly, stirred something in her chest that she'd thought was permanently closed. "I should probably get back to work," she said, though she made no move to dismiss him. "Of course." Silas replaced his hat, settling it at the familiar angle. "But if you change your mind about the help, I'm usually working somewhere within shouting distance. These beams aren't going to get any lighter, and winter's not going to wait for anyone." He walked back toward his truck, leaving Clara alone with her thoughts and the solid weight of the beam now properly positioned above her head. For the first time in 3 years, she'd allowed someone into her workspace, accepted help with a task that mattered to her. The experience had been less threatening than she'd expected, but it opened questions about how much independence she could maintain while still ensuring her child's safety and security. She placed her hand on her belly, feeling the baby's movement in response to her elevated heart rate. The little one was active today, perhaps sensing the change in routine, the presence of another person in their carefully controlled world. "Well, little one," she murmured, "looks like we might have ourselves a neighbor after all." Silas's worn work gloves lay on Clara's makeshift table the next morning, forgotten in his hurry to help with an escaped heifer that had wandered onto her property. She'd found the gloves after he'd gone, soft leather shaped by years of honest work, still warm from his hands. Now they sat beside her coffee cup like a question waiting for an answer. The morning routine had changed. Instead of singing alone while she worked, Clara found herself listening for the sound of his truck, the steady rhythm of his hammer against fence posts. When he appeared at his usual spot along the boundary line, she felt an unexpected lightness that had nothing to do with her advancing pregnancy. "Morning, Mrs. Whitcomb," he called across the distance, touching his hat brim in greeting. "Just Clara," she called back. "And you left these yesterday." She held up the gloves. Silas walked closer, stopping at the edge of her work area. "Much obliged. These old hands don't work as well as they used to without protection." Clara noticed how he maintained a respectful distance, never presuming to enter her space without invitation. The consideration struck her as old-fashioned in the best way, the kind of manners her father had practiced, based on genuine respect rather than mere politeness. "Coffee's still warm if you want some," she offered, surprising herself with the invitation. "That's kind of you." Silas accepted the tin cup she poured, inhaling the steam with obvious appreciation. "Good coffee. Been drinking my own for so long I'd forgotten what properly made tastes like." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sun climb higher over the valley rim. Clara had forgotten how pleasant it could be to share the morning quiet with someone who didn't feel the need to fill every moment with conversation. "How's the work progressing?" Silas asked, noting the additional stones she'd mortared into place since yesterday. "Steady enough. Should have the walls to window height by week's end if the weather holds." Clara gestured toward the foundation, where her careful stonework created clean, straight lines. "The roof will be the real challenge. I've never shingled alone before." "Shingling's not hard, just methodical. Start at the bottom, work your way up, keep everything straight and overlapped proper." Silas examined her wall construction with obvious approval. "You've got the skill for it, just need someone to handle the heavy lifting while you do the precise work." The offer was implicit but clear. Clara felt the familiar tension between her need for independence and the practical requirements of her situation. Pride wanted her to refuse, but common sense recognized the wisdom of accepting help when it was offered freely. "I suppose I could use an extra pair of hands," she said carefully, "but I can't pay wages." "Already told you that's not necessary." Silas finished his coffee and handed back the cup. "Good neighbors help each other. That's how community works." Community. The word stirred something in Clara that she'd thought was permanently settled. She'd spent 3 years avoiding community, choosing isolation over the complications that came with human connection. But standing here with this quiet man who asked nothing more than the chance to be useful, she wondered if she'd been running from the wrong things. "All right then," she said, "but we do this properly. You help me finish the cabin, and I'll find ways to return the favor. I'm a decent cook, and I can mend anything that needs stitching." "That's a fair trade." Silas smiled, the expression warming his weathered features. "Margaret used to say that good meals and mended clothes were worth more than money to a man living alone." The mention of his wife created a moment of shared understanding. They were both people who'd lost their primary partnerships, who'd learned to function alone, but hadn't forgotten the comfort of domestic cooperation. "What was she like?" Clara asked, curious about the woman who'd shaped this man's understanding of marriage and partnership. "Patient. That was her greatest gift, patience with the weather, with the livestock, with me when I got too focused on work to notice what was happening around me." Silas looked toward his ranch house, visible through the trees. "She made every place we lived feel like home just by being in it." Clara heard the love and loss in his voice, the way grief had settled into something that could be carried without breaking him. She recognized the tone because she'd found it in her own voice when speaking of Thomas. "He was gentle," she said, understanding that Silas would know she meant her husband. "Too gentle for this country, maybe. He followed me west because I wanted land and space, but he never quite adapted to the harshness of it." "Some people are made for comfort, others for struggle," Silas observed. "Neither way is wrong, but they don't always match up well." The comment held no judgment, just the recognition of someone who'd seen enough of life to understand its complications. Clara felt a loosening in her chest, a relief at being understood without having to explain or justify her choices. "I should get back to work," she said, though she made no immediate move to end the conversation. "Me too. Those fence posts won't set themselves." Silas pulled on his recovered gloves, flexing his fingers to settle the leather. "But I'll be working the north section today, if you need anything." After he left, Clara found herself working with more energy than she'd felt in weeks. The knowledge that help was available if needed removed a layer of constant worry that had been weighing on her without her full awareness. She didn't have to do everything alone anymore, didn't have to solve every problem with only her own resources. The baby moved actively as she worked, responding to her improved mood with increased activity. Clara paused to rest her hand on her belly, feeling the small kicks and turns that reminded her why all this effort mattered. "Your papa would have liked him," she murmured to the child. "Mr. Boone's got the same kind of steady strength that made your father such a good man. Different kind of strength maybe, but good solid character underneath." The admission surprised her. She hadn't intended to think of Silas in terms of character assessment, hadn't planned to measure him against Thomas's memory. But the comparison felt natural, not like a betrayal of her late husband's place in her heart. By afternoon, she'd made good progress on the wall construction, but the physical demands were taking their toll. Her back ached constantly now, and she had to rest more frequently as the baby pressed against her ribs and diaphragm. The work that had once been satisfying was becoming a race against her body's changing limitations. She was struggling with a particularly heavy stone when she heard footsteps approaching. Silas appeared around the corner of the cabin, carrying a wooden toolbox and wearing the expression of someone who'd come to work. "Thought you might could use a hand with the heavy lifting," he said, setting down his tools. "I finished my section early, and it looks like you're fighting with stones that don't want to cooperate." Clara wanted to insist she could manage, but the relief of seeing him was too strong to deny. "This one's been giving me trouble. The fit's perfect, but it's too heavy for me to position properly." "Let's have a look." Silas examined the stone and the gap where it belonged, mentally calculating angles and leverage points. "If we tip it this way and slide it from the side, the weight should work for us instead of against us." Working together, they maneuvered the stone into place with far less effort than Clara had been expending alone. The success felt like a small victory, a proof of concept for the kind of partnership they might develop. "You've got good instincts for this work," Clara said, genuinely impressed by his problem-solving approach. "Years of practice moving heavy things in awkward places." Silas wiped his hands on his pants, leaving streaks of stone dust and mortar. Cattle don't always cooperate with gates and chutes, so you learn to think like the weight you're trying to move. They worked together for the rest of the afternoon, settling into a comfortable rhythm of shared labor and occasional conversation. Clara noticed how Silas anticipated her needs without being told, how he provided strength where she lacked it, while never making her feel incapable or incompetent. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, they stepped back to survey their progress. The cabin walls had grown noticeably, reaching the point where the structure was beginning to look like an actual building, rather than just good intentions and hope. "That's a good day's work," Silas said with satisfaction. "Another week like this, and you'll have walls ready for a roof." "We'll have walls ready," Clara corrected, then paused at her own words. When had she started thinking in terms of we instead of I? Silas noticed the correction, but didn't comment on it directly. "I'd better get back to the ranch house. Cattle need to be checked, and I've got paperwork that won't do itself." He gathered his tools, moving with the efficient economy of someone accustomed to long days and multiple responsibilities. Clara watched him pack up, aware that she didn't want him to leave, that the approaching solitude felt heavier than it had before. "Same time tomorrow?" she asked, trying to keep her tone casual. "If the weather holds and you don't mind the company." Silas shouldered his toolbox. "Though I should warn you, once we start the roof work, there'll be no stopping until it's finished. Can't leave a building half-roofed with winter coming." "I understand." Clara did understand, both the practical necessity and the deeper implication. Once they committed to completing the roof together, they'd be partners in ensuring her shelter was ready before the baby came. The thought both thrilled and terrified her. After Silas left, Clara prepared her evening meal with more care than usual, setting her single plate and cup on the makeshift table with deliberate attention to small details. The day's work had reminded her of the satisfaction that came from shared effort, from having someone to discuss problems with and celebrate small victories alongside. But it had also awakened feelings she'd thought were safely buried with her past. The companionship, the easy conversation, the way Silas's presence made her feel less alone in the world, all of it carried the dangerous possibility of wanting more than she was prepared to risk. As darkness settled over the valley, Clara sat outside her partially completed cabin and listened to the night sounds. Somewhere down the hill, she could see a light in Silas's ranch house window, and the sight made her feel connected to something larger than her own solitary struggle. For the first time since Thomas's death, she fell asleep thinking about tomorrow, with anticipation rather than mere determination. The hymn came to Clara, unbidden as she worked, the same melody her mother had hummed while kneading bread in their Missouri kitchen. "Be Thou My Vision" had been passed down through 3 generations of women who'd found strength in its promise of divine guidance through uncertainty. Now, 8 months pregnant and mortaring stones in the Colorado wilderness, Clara understood why the tune had endured. Silas arrived as she reached the second verse, his approach quiet enough that her voice carried clearly across the morning air. He paused at the edge of her workspace, unwilling to interrupt what felt like a private moment between Clara and whatever faith had sustained her through loss and solitude. "My mother taught me that one," Clara said, aware of his presence without turning around. "She said it was the song of people who'd learned to trust when they couldn't see the path ahead. It's a good song for that." Silas set down his toolbox and removed his hat, the gesture automatic but respectful. "My Margaret used to hum it while she worked in her garden. Said it helped her remember that growing things took time and patience." Clara smiled at the shared connection, the way music could bridge the space between strangers and create unexpected intimacy. "Your Margaret sounds like she was a wise woman." "She was that." Silas pulled on his work gloves, the leather now familiar in his hands. "Used to say that hymns were just prayers set to music, so people could remember them better when times got hard." They worked together in comfortable silence, Clara directing the placement of stones, while Silas provided the strength to position them properly. The cabin walls had reached shoulder height, creating the sense of an actual room, rather than just a foundation with ambitions. Clara could stand inside and imagine the completed spacer, small but adequate home for herself and the baby, built with her own hands and designed for their specific needs. "Tell me about your faith," Silas said during a rest break, the question emerging from genuine curiosity rather than idle conversation. Clara considered the request, surprised by how much she wanted to share this part of herself with him. "It's been tested plenty over the years. Losing Thomas, the years of drifting, finding myself alone and expecting." She paused, her hand resting on her belly. "But I've never lost the sense that there's a purpose to all this, even when I can't see what it might be." "That's a hard kind of faith to maintain," Silas observed, "the kind that holds on when life doesn't make obvious sense. What about you? You seem like a man who's wrestled with the big questions." Silas was quiet for a long moment, mixing mortar with steady, practiced motions. "Margaret's death shook me pretty hard, made me angry at God for a while, if I'm being honest. Couldn't understand why a woman that good, that necessary, had to suffer the way she did." Clara heard the pain in his voice, the way grief had left its mark on his relationship with faith. "Did you find your way back to peace with it?" "Some days better than others." Silas looked toward the mountains, where morning clouds were building into the afternoon thunderheads that would bring rain by evening. "But I've come to think that faith isn't about understanding God's plans. It's about trusting that there's love underneath all the mystery, even when we can't feel it." The conversation created a deeper intimacy between them, the kind that came from sharing the fundamental questions that shaped their lives. Clara felt the walls she'd built around her heart, shifting, not crumbling, but becoming more permeable. "This baby," she said, surprising herself with the admission, "sometimes I wonder if it's Thomas's way of giving me a reason to keep building instead of just surviving." Silas nodded, understanding the distinction. "Seems like the kind of gift a loving husband might arrange, if such things were possible." They resumed work, but the quality of their silence had changed. The shared conversation about faith and loss had created a foundation of trust that went deeper than their working partnership. Clara found herself singing more freely, and Silas began humming along with melodies he recognized. By midday, they'd completed another full course of stones, bringing the walls to the height where window frames would be installed. The progress felt significant, a clear milestone in the cabin's transformation from dream to reality. "You'll want to get those window frames in soon," Silas observed, examining the openings Clara had carefully measured and maintained. "Once the walls get much higher, it becomes harder to fit them properly. I've got them cut and sanded, but I wasn't sure about the best way to set them." Clara gestured toward the lumber she'd prepared. Window frames, built to her own specifications rather than purchased from a catalogue. "Nice work on those," Silas said, examining her carpentry with obvious approval. "Square and true, joints tight. You've got a real gift for woodworking." The praise warmed Clara in ways she hadn't expected. Recognition of her skills from someone whose opinion she'd come to value meant more than casual compliments from strangers. "My father used to say that wood would tell you what it wanted to become, if you paid attention to its grain and character." Clara ran her hand along one of the frames, feeling the smooth surface she'd achieved through careful sanding. "These pieces of pine seemed to want to be windows, so I let them." "That's a carpenter's way of thinking," Silas agreed. "Most people try to force wood into shapes it doesn't want to hold. Better to work with its natural tendencies." They spent the afternoon installing the window frames, a precise job that required careful measurement and adjustment. Clara appreciated how Silas followed her lead, providing assistance without trying to take over the decisions. He seemed to understand that this was her project, her vision being made real, and his role was to help rather than direct. As they worked, Clara found herself sharing more of her history, the tent camps where she'd lived, the various jobs she'd taken to survive, the gradual realization that she needed to create something permanent for her child. Silas listened without judgment, occasionally asking questions that showed he understood the challenges she'd faced. "You've done well for yourself," he said as they fitted the last window frame into place. Not many people could have made the journey you've made and still have the strength to build something new. I had good reason to keep going. Clara placed her hand on her belly, feeling the baby's response to her touch. This little one deserves better than what I've been able to provide so far. From what I can see, you're providing plenty, Silas said quietly. A home built with love and determination, a mother who won't give up when things get difficult. That's more than a lot of children ever get. The comment touched something deep in Clara's chest, a fear she'd been carrying about whether she could be a good enough parent while still dealing with her own grief and uncertainty. Hearing Silas's confidence in her abilities provided a comfort she hadn't known she needed. Late in the afternoon, the promised storm arrived with dramatic suddenness. Dark clouds rolled over the valley rim, bringing wind that bent the trees and rain that fell in sheets. Clara and Silas took shelter in the partially completed cabin, standing beneath the open rafters while water drummed against the stone walls. "This is what it will feel like when it's finished," Clara said, listening to the storm rage outside while feeling protected by the walls they'd built together. Safe and solid, even when the weather turns rough. "You've chosen your materials well," Silas observed, noting how the stone construction shed water without showing signs of weakness. "This cabin will stand for generations if it's maintained properly." The storm intensified, making it clear that work was finished for the day. But neither of them seemed eager to leave the shelter they'd created. The sense of accomplishment that came from weathering their first storm together in the building that represented their shared effort. "I should head back before the road gets too muddy," Silas said reluctantly, though he made no immediate move toward the door. "Of course." Clara walked to one of the newly installed windows, watching the rain cascade down the glass they'd set that morning. "Thank you for today. For the work, but also for the conversation. I'd forgotten how good it feels to share the day with someone." "I've enjoyed it too," Silas admitted. "Been a long time since I had someone to talk to about things that matter." They looked at each other across the small space, both aware that something had shifted between them during the day's work and conversation. The connection wasn't romantic yet, but it carried the possibility of becoming something more significant than simple neighborly cooperation. "Same time tomorrow?" Clara asked, echoing their established routine. "Weather permitting," Silas agreed, pulling on his jacket. "Though we might want to think about starting the roof work soon. This kind of storm will be more common as we head into fall." After he left, Clara remained in her partially completed cabin, listening to the rain and thinking about the day's revelations. The shared conversation about faith, the easy collaboration on construction tasks, the growing comfort she felt in Silas's presence, all of it pointed toward a connection she hadn't expected to find again. But with the connection came risk. Opening her heart to another person meant the possibility of loss, of grief, of the kind of pain she'd barely survived once before. The question was whether the promise of companionship and shared purpose was worth the vulnerability that came with caring for someone again. As the storm began to ease, Clara prepared her evening meal and set her single place at the table. But for the first time in months, the solitude felt temporary rather than permanent, like a choice she was making, rather than a condition imposed upon her by circumstances. The baby kicked strongly, as if responding to her mother's changing emotional state. Clara placed both hands on her belly, feeling the life that would soon join her in this small but sturdy shelter. "What do you think, little one?" she murmured. "Is it time for us to start trusting other people again?" The answer came not in words, but in the deep satisfaction she felt when looking at the day's progress, the walls that had risen through shared effort and the windows that would soon let in light and warmth. Some things, she realized, were simply too big to build alone. The shared meal began as a simple gesture of gratitude, Clara's way of acknowledging the help Silas had provided over the past weeks. But as she prepared venison stew in the iron pot over her outdoor fire, measuring ingredients with the same care she applied to her stonework, she realized she was creating more than just dinner. She was extending an invitation into the domestic space she'd guarded so carefully since Thomas's death. Silas arrived at sunset, carrying a jar of honey and a loaf of bread wrapped in clean cloth. "Thought these might go well with whatever you're cooking," he said, removing his hat as he approached her fire circle. "You didn't need to bring anything," Clara protested, though she was touched by the thoughtfulness of the gesture. "Margaret always said that coming to dinner empty-handed was poor manners," Silas replied, settling the bread and honey on her makeshift table. "Besides, I haven't had a proper meal with company in longer than I care to admit." Clara ladled stew into 2 bowls, the portions generous despite her careful rationing of supplies. They sat on upturned crates beside the fire, the partially completed cabin rising behind them like a promise of future comfort. The setting was rustic, but the meal felt more civilized than anything Clara had experienced since leaving the settled world behind. "This is excellent," Silas said after his first taste, genuine appreciation in his voice. "You've got a gift for cooking as well as building." "Practice from the work camps," Clara explained. "You learn to make something satisfying from whatever's available, or people complain and you lose the job." They ate in comfortable silence, watching stars emerge in the clear mountain sky. The intimacy of sharing food, of sitting together at the end of a productive day, felt both natural and significant. Clara couldn't remember the last time she'd prepared a meal for someone else, couldn't recall when simple companionship had felt so restoring. "Tell me about your dreams for this place," Silas said as they finished eating. "Once the cabin's complete and the baby's born, what do you see happening here?" The question surprised Clara with its assumption of permanence, its suggestion that her current struggles were temporary steps towards something larger. She'd been so focused on immediate survival that she'd barely allowed herself to imagine a future beyond basic shelter and safety. "I suppose I want it to feel like home," she said slowly, working through thoughts she'd rarely spoken aloud. "Not just shelter, but the kind of place where a child can grow up feeling secure and loved. Maybe expand the cabin eventually, add a proper kitchen, a room for the baby when it's older." "What about income? How do you plan to support yourself and the child?" Clara appreciated the practical nature of his question, the way he treated her plans as realistic rather than merely hopeful. "I'm good with my hands carpentry, sewing, cooking. There are always people who need those skills, even in remote areas, and the land has mineral rights. If I find anything valuable, that could provide security." "It's good land," Silas agreed, looking around the valley with the eye of someone who understood its potential. "Water, timber, protection from the worst weather. You chose well." "What about you?" Clara asked, turning the conversation toward his future. "Do you plan to manage the Morrison place indefinitely?" Silas was quiet for a moment, poking at the fire with a stick. "That depends on things beyond my control. The owners back east have been making noises about selling. If they do, the new owners might want their own management, or they might decide to break up the property for development." "What would you do if that happened?" "I've got some savings, enough to buy a small place if the right opportunity came along." He looked toward her cabin, then back at the fire. "I'm 60, 1 year old, Clara. At some point, a man has to stop working for other people's dreams and start thinking about what he wants his final years to look like." The comment hung between them, loaded with implications about planning and permanence, about the choices that people make when they realize time is finite. Clara felt the weight of unspoken possibilities, the question of whether their growing connection might develop into something that affected both their futures. "Home," she said thoughtfully, returning to his original question. "I want this place to be the kind of home where people feel welcome, where the door's always open to neighbors who need help or just want company, like my parents' house when I was young." "That's a worthy dream," Silas smiled, the expression warm in the firelight. "Takes courage to open your door to community when you've learned to protect yourself through solitude." "Maybe I'm tired of protecting myself," Clara admitted, surprising herself with the honesty of the statement. 3 years of isolation taught me I could survive alone, but it didn't teach me how to live." The distinction resonated with Silas, who'd spent 5 years learning the same difficult lesson. Surviving and living aren't the same thing, are they? Margaret used to say that life wasn't worth much if you couldn't share its joys and sorrows with someone who understood. She sounds like she was a wise woman. She was, and she would have liked you. Silas met Clara's eyes across the fire. She would have appreciated your strength and your determination to build something good for your child. Clara felt tears threaten at the unexpected blessing from a woman she'd never met, but whose influence on Silas was evident in his character and values. Thank you for saying that. It means more than you might realize. They sat in comfortable silence, both lost in thoughts about the past and the future, about the strange way life could bring people together when they least expected it. The fire burned lower, casting dancing shadows against the cabin walls that rose around them like a promise of shelter and security. I should probably head back, Silas said reluctantly, though he made no immediate move to leave. Early morning tomorrow, and we've got roof work to think about soon. The roof. Clara felt a mixture of excitement and anxiety about the next phase of construction. I've been dreading that part, if I'm honest. It's one thing to build walls stone by stone, but roofing requires speed and precision. I'm not sure I can manage alone. You won't be alone, Silas said quietly. We've come this far together, and I'm not about to abandon the project before it's finished. The promise of continued partnership warmed Clara more than the fire. Why are you doing this, Silas? Really? You barely know me, and you've already given more help than anyone could reasonably expect. Silas considered the question seriously, understanding that his answer mattered to both of them. Because building something that will last feels important at my age. Because helping you succeed feels like the right use of whatever skills and strength I have left. And because, he paused, choosing his words carefully, because I've been lonely for a long time, and working beside you has reminded me what it feels like to be part of something larger than just daily survival. Clara felt her heart respond to his honesty, the way his admission of loneliness echoed her own experience. I've been lonely too, she said softly. Longer than I wanted to admit, even to myself. Then maybe we're helping each other with more than just construction, Silas suggested, his voice gentle but direct. Maybe we are. Clara stood and began clearing their dishes, needing movement to process the emotional weight of their conversation. I should warn you, though I'm not easy to be around sometimes. I've gotten used to doing things my own way, making decisions without consulting anyone else. I'm 61 and set in my ways, Silas replied, helping her stack the bowls. I snore, I get grumpy when I'm hungry, and I talk to cattle like they understand English. If we're cataloguing potential problems, I've got my share. Clara laughed, the sound surprising her with its lightness. Well, as long as we're being honest about our flaws. Honesty seems like a good foundation for whatever this is becoming, Silas agreed. Friendship, partnership, whatever we want to call it. As he prepared to leave, Clara felt the approaching solitude more acutely than she had in weeks. The evening's conversation had opened spaces in her heart that she'd thought were permanently closed, had reminded her of the deep satisfaction that came from being truly known by another person. Silas, she called as he reached his truck, thank you, for dinner, for the conversation, for treating my dreams like they matter. They do matter, he said simply, and so do you. After his truck disappeared down the mountain road, Clara sat by the dying fire and contemplated the evening's revelations. The shared meal had become something more significant than she'd intended, a tentative step toward the kind of domestic partnership she'd thought was lost forever with Thomas's death. But this potential partnership with Silas felt different from her marriage, shaped by the experience and wisdom that came from surviving loss. There was less desperation in it, less need to merge their identities completely, and more appreciation for the individual strength each brought to their connection. The baby moved strongly, responding to Clara's elevated heart rate and the emotional intensity of the evening. She placed her hands on her belly, feeling the life that would soon join her in this small but growing sanctuary. Well, little one, she murmured, echoing her earlier conversation with the child. Looks like we might not be building this life entirely alone after all. The fire collapsed into glowing coals, casting final shadows against the cabin walls. Clara banked the embers carefully, ensuring they'd provide warmth through the cool mountain night. As she prepared for sleep, She found herself looking forward to tomorrow with an anticipation that had nothing to do with construction progress and everything to do with the quiet man who'd shared her table and listened to her dreams with respectful attention. For the first time since Thomas's death, Clara fell asleep thinking about the future as something to be shared rather than endured alone. The baby's cradle took shape in Silas's workshop during the quiet evening hours when ranch work was finished and solitude felt heaviest. He'd chosen seasoned pine for its lightness and cedar for its aromatic properties, joining the woods with traditional methods that would ensure the cradle's durability for generations. Each curved rocker, each carefully sanded rail, represented his growing investment in Clara's future and the child she carried. Working with hand tools by lamplight, Silas found himself thinking about legacy in ways he hadn't since Margaret's death. The cradle wasn't just furniture, it was a statement of faith in tomorrow, a tangible expression of hope that life could be renewed even after devastating loss. Every joint he fitted, every surface he smoothed, carried the weight of his commitment to the small family taking shape on the hill above his ranch. He'd started the project impulsively, moved by something in Clara's voice when she spoke about preparing for the baby's arrival. But as the cradle developed under his hands, it became something more deliberate, a gift that would communicate feelings he wasn't yet ready to speak aloud, an offering that acknowledged his desire to be part of the life she was building. The morning Clara discovered the cradle, she'd come to his workshop looking for him after he'd failed to appear at his usual time. Her pregnancy had progressed to the point where climbing the hill to her cabin required significant effort, so Silas had taken to meeting her at the boundary between their properties. When he wasn't there, concern had driven her to seek him out. "Silas?" she called from the workshop doorway, her voice carrying the slight breathlessness that came with her advancing pregnancy. "Are you all right? You weren't—" She stopped mid-sentence, her attention caught by the cradle sitting on his workbench like a prayer made tangible. The wood glowed with careful finishing, every curve designed for both beauty and function. It was clearly meant for a baby, but more than that, it was clearly meant for her baby. "Oh," she breathed, moving closer despite her bulk. "Silas, this is beautiful." He straightened from the corner where he'd been organizing tools, suddenly self-conscious about the presumption of his gift. "I hope you don't mind. I just thought with the baby coming you might could use something like this." Clara ran her fingers along the cradle's smooth rails, testing the gentle motion of the rockers. The craftsmanship was exquisite, but what moved her most was the obvious care that had gone into every detail. This wasn't just functional furniture. It was love made visible. "Mind?" she said, tears threatening. "Silas, this is the most thoughtful gift anyone's ever given me, but I can't accept something this valuable without." "Without what?" he asked gently. "Without paying for it. Clara, this isn't about money or obligation. It's about wanting to do something good for you and the baby." "But why?" The question came out more plaintively than she'd intended, revealing the depth of her confusion about his motivations. "We barely know each other. You don't owe me anything." Silas set down his tools and gave her his full attention, understanding that his answer would shape whatever developed between them. "Because in the weeks we've been working together, I've come to care about what happens to you. Because I want your child to have every advantage, every comfort I can provide. And because—" he paused, then continued with quiet honesty, "because making this cradle has given me more satisfaction than anything I've done in years." Clara felt the emotional weight of his words, the way they acknowledged feelings that were growing between them, despite their careful maintenance of boundaries. The cradle represented a crossing point, an admission that their connection had moved beyond simple neighborly cooperation. "I don't know what to say," she admitted, still touching the cradle's gentle curves. "You don't have to say anything. Just let me be part of this good thing you're creating." Silas moved closer, his voice carrying the vulnerability of someone taking an emotional risk. "I know our situations are complicated, your pregnancy, our age difference, the fact that we're both still carrying grief from our losses. But I also know that the weeks we've spent working together have been the best I've had in years." Clara looked up from the cradle to meet his eyes, seeing there the same confusion and hope that she'd been feeling. They've been good for me too. Better than good, they've made me remember what it feels like to look forward to tomorrow. Then maybe that's enough for now, Silas suggested. Maybe we don't have to figure out what this is or where it's going. Maybe we just accept that it's good and see what develops. The suggestion carried both wisdom and uncertainty, an acknowledgement that whatever was growing between them needed time and patience to develop properly. Clara felt relief at not having to define their relationship immediately, at being allowed to let her feelings evolve naturally. "The cradle will be perfect in the cabin," she said, returning to the safer ground of practical matters. "Though I have to warn you, I still have a few weeks of construction work before there's a proper place to put it." "About that," Silas said, his expression growing serious, "we need to talk about the roof work. It can't wait much longer, your condition's advancing, and the weather's getting less predictable." Clara had been dreading this conversation, knowing that the roof represented the most challenging phase of construction. Unlike stonework, which could be done gradually, roofing required sustained effort and precise timing to ensure weather-tight completion. "I've been thinking about it," she admitted. "The truth is, I'm not sure I can handle the physical demands anymore. Just walking up here this morning left me winded." "That's what I figured." Silas moved to a corner of the workshop where rolled blueprints were stored. "I've been working on some ways to modify our approach, so you can direct the work without having to do the heavy lifting." He spread out drawings on his workbench, sketches that showed various rigging systems and staging platforms. The plans revealed hours of thought about how to complete the roof safely and efficiently, despite Clara's physical limitations. "You've been planning this," Clara said with amazement, studying the detailed drawings. "I've been thinking about it," Silas corrected. "This roof has to be done right the first time, because there won't be opportunities to fix mistakes once winter sets in. That means careful planning and proper equipment." Clara studied the rigging diagrams, impressed by the thoroughness of his preparation. "This looks like it would work, but it's a lot more complicated than I'd originally planned." "Complicated but safer, and more likely to succeed." Silas pointed to various elements of his plan. "The key is having everything prepared in advance, materials sorted, tools positioned, weather window confirmed. Once we start, we work until it's finished, no matter how long that takes." "How long are we talking about?" 2, maybe 3 days if everything goes smoothly. Longer if we run into problems or weather delays." Silas looked at her seriously. "It's going to be intense, Clara. Are you prepared for that kind of push?" Clara considered the question, weighing her physical limitations against her desperate need for completed shelter. The baby was due in less than 6 weeks, and mountain winter could arrive any time after October 1st. "I don't have much choice," she said finally. "This cabin has to be finished before the baby comes, and that means doing whatever's necessary to complete the roof." "All right then," Silas began rolling up his drawings. "I'll start gathering materials and setting up the rigging. Give me a week to get everything ready, then we'll watch for a stable weather pattern and make our push." As they walked back toward Clara's building site, she found herself thinking about the implications of Silas's commitment. The roof work would require them to work in close cooperation for several intensive days, sharing the stress and satisfaction of completing her most challenging construction project. "Silas," she said as they reached the boundary between their properties, "I want you to know how much all this means to me. The help with construction, the cradle, the way you've treated my dreams as if they matter. I haven't had someone care about my welfare in a long time." "Your welfare does matter," he said simply. "To me, and to that baby you're carrying, and to this community, even if it doesn't know about you yet." "Community," Clara repeated, tasting the word that had become increasingly important to her. "Do you really think I can become part of a community here, someone who belongs instead of just surviving?" "I think you already are part of it," Silas replied. "Maybe a community of just 2 people right now, but that's how all communities start, with people who decide to care about each other's success." The comment stayed with Clara as she prepared for the evening, as she arranged her single-place setting and lit her solitary lamp. But tonight, the solitude felt temporary rather than permanent, like a pause between the chapters of a story that was still being written. The cradle sat in the corner of her partially completed cabin, its presence transforming the space from mere shelter into something that looked like a home preparing for new life. Clara placed her hand on her belly, feeling the strong movements of a child who would soon sleep in furniture built with love by a man who'd chosen to invest in their future. Outside, she could see lights in Silas's ranch house, and the sight no longer made her feel isolated. Instead, it reminded her that someone down the hill was also preparing for tomorrow, also thinking about the work they'd share and the progress they'd make together. For the first time since Thomas's death, Clara found herself planning for the future with confidence rather than mere hope, knowing that she wasn't building her new life entirely alone. The bank foreclosure notice arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a sheriff's deputy who looked uncomfortable with his task. Clara found Silas reading the document beside his truck, his face grim in the early sunlight. The official paper fluttered in the mountain breeze like a bird of prey settling on carrion. "What is it?" Clara asked, though the deputy's presence and Silas's expression already suggested the answer. "Eastern Mountain Bank is calling in the Morrison Ranch loan," Silas said, his voice carefully controlled. "Owners defaulted on payments 3 months ago, apparently. The property goes to auction in 30 days. Clara felt the ground shift beneath her feet, not from her pregnancy, but from the sudden recognition that the stability she'd been building could disappear as quickly as it had developed. "What does that mean for you?" "Means I'm out of a job and a home." Silas folded the notice with deliberate precision. "New owners will want their own management if they keep it as a working ranch at all. Could be they'll just break it up for development." The deputy cleared his throat, drawing their attention back to his remaining duties. "Ma'am, I've got another notice here for you. Seems your property claim is being challenged by the same bank." Clara's blood turned cold as she accepted the second document. Her hands shook as she read the legal language that essentially accused her of fraudulent land purchase, claiming that her property had been included in the Morrison Ranch's original mortgage as collateral. "That's impossible," she said, her voice rising with panic. "I bought this land fair and square, with clear title. I have the deed. Bank says the deed was issued in error," the deputy explained, clearly uncomfortable with delivering such devastating news. "Says the land was already committed as loan security when it was sold to you." Clara sank onto a nearby boulder, the weight of impending motherhood and potential homelessness combining to overwhelm her composure. Everything she'd worked for, everything she'd built, could be stripped away by legal technicalities she didn't understand. "There has to be something we can do," she said, looking to Silas for the kind of practical guidance he'd provided throughout their partnership. "Some way to fight this." Silas studied both notices, his mind working through the implications and possibilities. "First thing we need is a lawyer who understands land law and banking regulations. Second thing we need is to understand exactly what financial mess the Morrison family got themselves into." "I can't afford a lawyer," Clara said quietly. "I spent everything I had on the land purchase and building materials." "Money's not the only consideration here." Silas looked toward her half-completed cabin, then back at the legal documents. "If the bank's claim is valid, they'll own both properties. But if their claim is fraudulent or based on errors, we might be able to fight it." Clara felt tears threaten as the full scope of their situation became clear. "Even if we fight it and win, how long will that take? The baby's due in 5 weeks. I can't give birth in a tent because some banker back east decided to seize my land." The deputy shifted uncomfortably, clearly wanting to complete his duties and leave. "I'm sorry, folks. I just deliver the papers. You'll want to contact the bank directly or get legal representation." He touched his hat brim and walked back to his vehicle, leaving Clara and Silas alone with the documents that threatened to destroy everything they'd built. "There's something else," Silas said after the deputy had driven away. His voice carried a weight that suggested additional bad news. "Something I should have told you weeks ago." Clara looked up, seeing guilt and regret in his expression. "What?" "The materials for your cabin lumber, the hardware, some of the tools I've been lending you. I bought them with ranch funds, charged them to the Morrison account." Silas met her eyes directly, accepting responsibility for his choices. "I told myself it was legitimate ranch business, maintenance and improvement expenses. But the truth is, I was using the ranch's credit to help you because I knew you couldn't afford everything you needed." The admission hit Clara like a physical blow. "You've been stealing to help me." "I've been borrowing against my final wages," Silas corrected, though the distinction felt thin. "I planned to settle the account when I left the job. But if the bank seizes everything immediately, there won't be time to make it right." Clara struggled to process this revelation on top of the foreclosure threat. The man she'd come to trust, to care for, had been deceiving her about the source of his generosity. Worse, his deception might have legal consequences that could affect both their futures. "How much money are we talking about?" she asked, dreading the answer. "Close to $800, including materials and equipment." Silas's voice was steady but strained. "More than I can cover with my savings, especially if I'm about to lose my job." Clara stood slowly, her hand pressed against her back for support. The physical discomfort of late pregnancy seemed insignificant compared to the emotional weight of betrayal and impending loss. "So let me understand this," she said, working to keep her voice level. "The land I thought I owned might not be mine. The cabin I've been building might be constructed on someone else's property. And the materials we've been using were essentially stolen from the bank that's trying to evict both of us." "That's about the size of it," Silas admitted, "though I prefer to think of it as unauthorized borrowing rather than stealing. The result is the same, isn't it?" Clara turned away, unable to look at him while processing the scope of their predicament. "We could both be charged with theft on top of losing our homes." Silas was quiet for a long moment, understanding that his attempts to help had created complications far beyond what either of them had anticipated. "I'm sorry, Clara. I thought I was solving problems, but I've made everything worse." "You should have told me," she said, her voice carrying hurt as well as anger. "I had a right to know that my building materials were essentially stolen, that my construction project was based on deception." "You're right. I should have been honest from the beginning." Silas looked toward the cabin that represented so much hope and effort. I wanted to help, and I knew you wouldn't accept charity, so I convinced myself that borrowing against future wages was different from outright theft." Clara walked to the cabin's doorway, looking at the walls they'd raised together and the roof that still needed completion. Everything she'd built, everything she'd hoped for, suddenly felt as insubstantial as the morning mist that drifted through the valley. "What happens now?" she asked, placing her hand on the stone walls that might no longer belong to her. "Now we figure out how to fight this," Silas said, his voice carrying new determination. "We find out exactly what legal standing the bank has, what rights you have as a legitimate purchaser, and what options exist for people in our situation. And if we can't fight it, if the bank's claim is legitimate?" Silas was quiet for a moment, considering possibilities he didn't want to voice. "Then we figure out how to start over somewhere else, together, if you'll have me." The offer surprised Clara with its implications. Despite the deception, despite the legal trouble, Silas was suggesting that their partnership could survive even the loss of their current homes and plans. "Together," she repeated, testing the word's weight. "Even though your help has created legal problems that could affect both our futures?" "Especially because of that," Silas said firmly. "I got us into this mess, and I'm not going to abandon you to deal with the consequences alone." Clara felt the baby move strongly, responding to her elevated stress levels. The child she carried would be born into uncertainty, would begin life without the security and stability she'd worked so hard to provide. The thought broke her heart in ways that her own potential losses couldn't. "I need time to think," she said finally. "Time to understand what our options really are, what fighting this might cost, what starting over would require." "Of course." Silas gathered the legal documents, handling them like they might bite. "I'll drive into town today, Talk to whoever handles legal matters at the courthouse. Try to understand exactly what we're up against." As he prepared to leave, Clara felt the strange mixture of gratitude and betrayal that had characterized so much of her life. The man who'd helped her build towards security had also created new forms of insecurity. The partnership that had given her hope for the future was now clouded by deception and legal complications. "Silas," she called as he reached his truck. "Whatever happens with the legal situation, I want you to know that the help you've given, meth work, the companionship, the belief in what I was trying to build, that meant everything to me. Even if it all gets taken away." "It won't get taken away," he said with quiet conviction. "Maybe not here, maybe not in the way we planned, but what we've built together is more than just property and structures. That can't be foreclosed on or seized by banks." After he left, Clara sat in her partially completed cabin and tried to process the morning's revelations. The silence that had once felt peaceful now seemed oppressive, filled with the weight of decisions she wasn't prepared to make and consequences she hadn't anticipated. The cradle that Silas had built sat in the corner like a promise that might not be kept, a symbol of hope that legal realities could render meaningless. Clara placed her hand on her belly, feeling the life that would soon need the security and stability that seemed to be slipping away like water through her fingers. Outside, the valley spread around her in its magnificent indifference, beautiful and harsh, and unconcerned with human plans and dreams. Clara had chosen this place for its isolation and independence, but now she understood that no one was truly independent, that everyone's security depended on systems and institutions that could change without warning. The question now was whether the partnership she'd developed with Silas was strong enough to survive the loss of everything they'd thought they were building together, whether their connection was based on shared work and common dreams or on something deeper that could weather any storm. The legal documents spread across Clara's makeshift table like battle plans for a war she'd never intended to fight. Silas had returned from town with a mixture of troubling news and unexpected hope. His conversations with the courthouse clerk and a retired lawyer revealing both the scope of their problems and potential paths toward resolution. "The Morrison family's been in financial trouble for 3 years, Silas explained, pointing to papers that outlined the ranch's mortgage history. "They borrowed against the property multiple times, using the same land as collateral for different loans. Your parcel was apparently included in one of those deals, even though they'd already sold it to you." Clara studied the documentation, trying to make sense of legal language that seemed designed to confuse rather than clarify. "So they sold me land they'd already promised to the bank?" "That's what it looks like. But here's the interesting part. Your deed predates their mortgage agreement by 6 months. If we can prove you purchased in good faith, with clear title, the bank's claim might not hold up in court." "Might not hold up," Clara repeated, hearing the uncertainty in Silas's explanation. "That's not exactly reassuring when I'm facing homelessness with a baby due in 4 weeks." Silas moved to the window, looking toward the valley where neighbors he'd mentioned during their research lived in scattered homesteads. "There's something else. I talked to Judge Morrison's relation to the ranch family about our situation. He suggested we might have community support if we decide to fight this." "Community support how?" "Turns out several other families have been dealing with Eastern Mountain Bank's aggressive collection practices. There's talk of organizing a legal defense fund, pooling resources to challenge what some folks think are fraudulent foreclosure claims." Clara felt a flicker of hope, though experience had taught her to be cautious about help that seemed too good to be true. "Why would neighbors I've never met want to help fight my legal battles?" "Because your situation affects property values and land security for everyone in the valley. If the bank can seize your legitimately purchased land through technicalities, no one's property is truly safe." Silas returned to the table, pulling out additional papers. "Judge Morrison thinks we might have enough evidence to request an injunction, delay the foreclosure until the ownership questions can be properly resolved." Clara examined the evidence they'd gathered: her original deed, the Morrison family's mortgage documents, records of payments she'd made, and documentation of improvements she'd made to the property. The paper trail was complex, but it suggested that her claim to the land was legitimate and prior to the bank's security interest. "What about the materials you charged to the ranch account?" she asked, addressing the elephant that had been sitting in the room since the foreclosure notice arrived. "I've spoken to the bank about that directly," Silas said, his expression serious. "Explained that the charges were against my final wages and that I'm prepared to settle the account immediately. They seemed more interested in the property seizure than in pursuing theft charges over building materials. Seemed more interested isn't the same as dropping the issue entirely. No, but it suggests that if we can resolve the land ownership question, the materials issue might get resolved as part of the larger settlement." Silas sat across from her, his hands folded on the table. "Clara, I want you to understand something. Whatever happens with this legal fight, I take full responsibility for the complications my actions created. You didn't know about the unauthorized charges, and you shouldn't face consequences for decisions I made without your knowledge." Clara appreciated his acceptance of responsibility, though it didn't remove the stress of their situation. "Taking responsibility is admirable, but it doesn't solve our immediate problems. I still need shelter for this baby, and I still don't have the money to fight a prolonged legal battle." "About that," Silas said, pulling out a final document, "I've been thinking about our resource situation, and I have a proposal that might address both our housing needs and our financial limitations." Clara looked at the paper he'd placed before her, property deed for 40 acres, adjacent to her claimed land, property that Silas apparently owned free and clear. "I bought this land 5 years ago, after Margaret died," he explained. "Thought I might build a small place here eventually, something that was mine, instead of just managing someone else's property. It's been sitting unused while I tried to decide what to do with my life. And now I'm thinking that if the bank takes your land, we could combine our resources and build on mine. If your land ownership gets confirmed, we could combine the properties and create something larger than either of us could manage alone." Clara stared at the deed, understanding the implications of what Silas was suggesting. "You're talking about partnership in a much bigger sense than just helping with construction." "I'm talking about marriage," Silas said quietly, the words carrying weight and vulnerability. "Not just for legal convenience or resource pooling, though those are practical considerations. I'm talking about marriage because over these past weeks, I've come to care for you in ways I didn't expect to feel again." The proposal hit Clara like a thunderbolt, transforming their conversation from crisis management to life-changing decision. She'd been focused on immediate survival, on securing shelter for her child, and hadn't allowed herself to consider the possibility that her growing feelings for Silas might develop into something permanent. "Silas," she began, then stopped, unsure how to respond to such a momentous offer during such a stressful time. "I know it's sudden," he continued, reading her hesitation correctly. "I know you're still dealing with grief from your first marriage, and I know the timing is complicated with the baby coming and the legal troubles. But I also know that I love you, Clara. I love your strength and your determination and your refusal to give up when things get difficult." Clara felt tears threatening, moved by his declaration but overwhelmed by the complexity of their situation. "I care for you too, more than I thought I'd ever care for anyone again. But marriage, that's such a big step and everything's so uncertain right now. Marriage would give us legal standing to combine our resources and fight the bank's claims together," Silas pointed out. "But more than that, it would give us the security of facing whatever comes next as a team, instead of as individuals trying to survive alone." Clara placed her hand on her belly, feeling the baby's movement in response to her elevated emotions. The child would need stability and security, but it also deserved to be born into a family based on love rather than just practical necessity. "I need time to think about this," she said finally. "The marriage proposal, the legal strategy, all of it. It's a lot to process when I'm already dealing with the stress of impending motherhood and potential homelessness." "Of course," Silas agreed, though she could see disappointment in his eyes. "Take all the time you need. But don't take too long. We need to file the injunction request by Friday if we're going to delay the foreclosure." The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparation and emotional turmoil. Clara found herself making lists of legal documents, potential witnesses, and character references, while simultaneously trying to prepare for childbirth and considering the implications of Silas's marriage proposal. The multiple pressures created a constant state of anxiety that left her exhausted and overwhelmed. Silas worked tirelessly to gather evidence supporting their case, driving to neighboring homesteads to collect statements from property owners who dealt with Eastern Mountain Bank's questionable practices. He returned each evening with stories of families who'd successfully fought similar foreclosure attempts, but also tales of others who'd lost everything to legal technicalities and inadequate representation. Mrs. Henderson down the valley won her case by proving the bank had forged documents, he reported after one such trip. But it took 2 years and cost her most of her savings in legal fees. 2 years, Clara repeated, feeling the weight of that timeline. I can't fight a 2-year legal battle with a newborn baby and no stable income. That's why the Community Defense Fund matters, Silas explained. If enough families pool their resources and fight together, we can afford better legal representation and put more pressure on the bank to settle fairly. Clara appreciated the logic, but she also understood that community support came with obligations and expectations that might complicate her independence. Still, the alternative facing the bank's legal team alone seemed impossible given her resources and circumstances. On Thursday evening, as they reviewed their final preparations for the court filing, Clara made her decision about Silas's proposal. She'd spent hours walking the boundaries of her claimed property, thinking about the life she wanted to build for her child and the kind of partnership that could sustain them through future challenges. About your marriage proposal, she said as they sat beside the fire outside her cabin. I want you to know that my answer has nothing to do with our legal situation or resource needs. Silas looked up from the documents he'd been organizing, clearly trying to read her expression in the firelight. All right. I love you too, Clara said simply. I didn't expect to. Didn't want to risk caring for someone again after losing Thomas. But you've shown me that love doesn't diminish when it's shared with someone else. It just takes new forms. Clara, Silas breathed, hope and relief evident in his voice. But, she continued, holding up a hand to ensure he heard her completely, I won't marry you just to solve our legal problems or because it's convenient for property ownership. If we're going to make this commitment, it has to be because we genuinely want to build a life together, regardless of what happens with the foreclosure. That's exactly what I want, Silas said, moving closer to her on the log they'd been using as a bench. A life together, a family, a partnership that can weather whatever challenges come our way. Then yes, Clara said, feeling the rightness of the decision settle into her bones. Yes, I'll marry you. After we deal with the legal situation, after the baby's born, when we can make the commitment for the right reasons instead of just practical ones. Silas took her hands in his, the calloused skin warm and familiar from weeks of shared work. I love you, Clara Whitcomb. I love your courage and your stubbornness and your refusal to accept defeat. I love you too, Silas Boone. I love your steadiness and your patience and your willingness to invest in other people's dreams. They sat in comfortable silence, both understanding that they'd just committed to a future that was uncertain in its details, but solid in its emotional foundation. The legal battle ahead would test their partnership, but it would also prove whether their connection was strong enough to survive external pressures. We should probably get some rest, Clara said eventually, aware that tomorrow would bring the stress of court filings and legal maneuvering. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. It is, Silas agreed, but whatever happens tomorrow, we'll face it together. As Clara prepared for sleep in her partially completed cabin, she felt a complex mixture of anxiety and anticipation. The legal battle ahead was daunting, but the knowledge that she wouldn't face it alone provided strength she hadn't expected. More importantly, the commitment she'd just made to Silas represented a triumph over the fear and isolation that had dominated her life since Thomas's death. The baby moved strongly as she settled into bed, responding to her emotional state with increased activity. Clara placed both hands on her belly, speaking quietly to the child, who would soon join a family that was still taking shape. "Well, little one," she murmured, "looks like you're going to be born into quite an adventure. But you'll have people who love you, people who'll fight for your security and your future. That's more than a lot of children get." Outside, she could see lights in Silas's ranch house, and the sight no longer made her feel alone. Tomorrow would bring challenges that could change everything, but it would also bring the man who'd chosen to share those challenges with her, the partner who'd committed to building something lasting regardless of external circumstances. For the first time since receiving the foreclosure notice, Clara fell asleep, feeling hopeful about the future, confident that whatever tomorrow brought, she'd have the strength to face it with the man she loved by her side. Clara's labor pains began at dawn on the day they were scheduled to appear in court, sharp contractions that cut through her sleep like warnings of perfect timing's cruel absence. She lay still for several minutes, hoping the discomfort was false labor, the kind of practice contractions that had been troubling her for weeks. But the rhythmic intensity, the way the pain wrapped around her back and abdomen with unmistakable purpose, told her that her baby had chosen this day of all possible days to enter the world. She struggled to sit up, her movements hampered by the bulk of her pregnancy and the increasing strength of her contractions. Through the window of her partially completed cabin, she could see storm clouds building over the western peaks, dark masses that promised the kind of mountain weather that could isolate the valley for days. "Not today," she whispered to her unborn child, as if maternal authority could postpone natural processes. "We have legal battles to fight, homes to save. Can't you wait just one more day?" But even as she spoke, another contraction seized her, stronger than the previous ones, leaving no doubt that her baby was ready to be born regardless of external circumstances. Clara reached for the bell Silas had installed beside her bed, a simple communication system that would carry across the valley to alert him of emergencies. The sound rang clear in the morning air, echoing off the stone walls of her cabin and carrying down the hill toward the ranch house. Within minutes, she heard the roar of Silas's truck engine, the urgent sound of a man responding to a call for help. He burst through her door without knocking, his hair disheveled and his shirt half-buttoned, clearly having dressed in haste. "What's wrong? Are you hurt?" "The baby's coming," Clara said, gripping the edge of her table as another contraction built to its peak. "Started about 20 minutes ago, and they're getting stronger." Silas looked toward the window, where the storm clouds were building with ominous speed. "How far apart are the contractions?" "Maybe 5 minutes, but they're not regular yet." Clara tried to keep her voice calm, though fear was rising in her chest. "We need to get to town, find the doctor." "We need to try." Silas agreed, but his expression suggested he was calculating distances and timing with growing concern. "Let me get you some things together, then we'll head for the truck." As if summoned by their urgency, the first drops of rain began pattering against the windows, fat droplets that promised the deluge to come. Within minutes, the gentle patter had become a steady drumming, then a torrential downpour that turned the world outside grey and indistinct. "Silas!" Clara called, panic creeping into her voice as she realized what the storm meant for their travel plans. The road down the mountain in weather like this. "I know," he said grimly, gathering towels and blankets with the efficiency of someone who dealt with emergencies in remote locations. "But we have to try. We can't just sit here and hope for the best." They made it as far as the creek crossing before reality forced them to turn back. The normally shallow water had risen to a torrent that completely covered the bridge, making passage impossible even in Silas's heavy truck. Standing in the pouring rain, watching their escape route disappear beneath rushing water, they both understood that Clara would be giving birth in her unfinished cabin with only Silas to help. "All right," Clara said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice as they returned to the cabin. "All right, we can do this. Women have been having babies without doctors for thousands of years." "That's right," Silas agreed, though she could see the worry in his eyes. "And you're strong, Clara. Stronger than anyone I've ever known. This baby's going to be fine, and so are you." Back in the cabin, Clara tried to prepare mentally for what lay ahead, while Silas gathered supplies and built up the fire. The contractions were coming more frequently now, perhaps 4 minutes apart, with an intensity that made conversation difficult during their peaks. "Tell me what you know about delivering babies," Clara said during a brief respite between contractions. "I've helped with livestock births," Silas admitted, "but I've never delivered a human baby. Though I suppose the basic principles are similar: keep everything clean, support the mother, and try not to panic when things get intense." Clara might have laughed at his attempt at reassurance if not for the next contraction, which hit with enough force to double her over and drive all other thoughts from her mind. When it passed, she found herself gripping Silas's hand so tightly that her knuckles were white. "They're getting stronger," she said unnecessarily, since he'd just witnessed the evidence. "That's good," Silas said, though his voice carried uncertainty about whether anything happening right now could truly be considered good. "Means your body knows what it's doing, even if we don't." Outside, the storm intensified, wind driving rain against the windows, with the kind of violence that turned weather from inconvenience to genuine threat. The sound was overwhelming, a constant roar that made the cabin feel like a small boat in a vast ocean of chaos. "The court hearing," Clara said suddenly, remembering their legal obligations despite her current physical crisis. "We're supposed to be there in 3 hours." "The court hearing can wait," Silas said firmly. "Judge Morrison will understand when he hears what happened. Emergency situations take precedence over legal schedules. But the foreclosure if we don't file the injunction today." "Clara, look at me." Silas took her face in his hands, his eyes steady and sure. "Right now, the only thing that matters is you and this baby. Everything else, the legal fight, the property, all of it can be dealt with later. The most important thing happening in this valley today is the safe arrival of our child." Our child. The phrase settled into Clara's consciousness like a blessing. The recognition that this baby would be born into a family that was already complete in its commitment to love and protection. Whatever challenges lay ahead, this child would have 2 parents who'd chosen each other and chosen to face the future together. Another contraction seized her, this one lasting longer, and building to a peak that made her cry out despite her efforts to remain stoic. When it passed, she found herself breathing heavily, her body slick with perspiration despite the cabin's moderate temperature. "I think things are moving faster than I expected," she said, noting the shortened time between contractions and the increased intensity of the pain. "What do you need me to do?" Silas asked, his voice calm despite the obvious stress of their situation. "Boil water, find clean towels, and—" Clara paused as another contraction began building, "and pray that we both remember enough about birth to get through this safely." As Silas moved to follow her instructions, Clara found herself thinking about all the ways this day had deviated from their plans. They'd expected to spend it in legal battle, fighting for their right to remain on the land they'd come to love. Instead, they were fighting for something more fundamental: the safe arrival of new life in a storm-bound cabin with no professional help available. But looking around the small space they'd built together, feeling the solid walls that had risen through their shared effort, Clara realized that there was something fitting about her baby being born here. This cabin represented everything she'd hoped to create: security, permanence, a place where love could flourish despite external challenges. The next contraction hit with enough force to make her gasp, and Clara understood that they were moving rapidly toward the moment when her child would enter the world. Storm or no storm, legal battles or no legal battles, this baby was ready to be born into whatever circumstances awaited. The baby arrived with the storm's peak intensity, born into Silas's steady hands as thunder shook the cabin walls and rain drummed against the roof they'd built together. Clara's final push coincided with a lightning flash that illuminated the small room like a blessing, revealing the perfect features of a daughter who announced her arrival with a strong, healthy cry. "She's beautiful," Silas whispered, his voice thick with emotion as he cradled the tiny girl against his chest. "Clara, she's absolutely perfect." Clara laughed through her tears, exhausted but exhilarated by the successful birth and the sight of her daughter in the arms of the man who'd helped bring her safely into the world. Is she really all right? All her fingers and toes? 10 of each, Silas confirmed, carefully examining the baby before wrapping her in the clean towel he'd prepared. Strong lungs, good color, and she's looking around like she wants to take inventory of her new home. Clara reached for her daughter, feeling the indescribable relief and joy that came with holding her child for the first time. The baby was small but substantial, warm and alert, with dark hair that curled slightly at the edges and eyes that seemed to focus on Clara's face with surprising intensity. "Hello, little one," Clara murmured, tracing her finger along the baby's soft cheek. "I'm your mama, and this is—" She looked up at Silas, suddenly uncertain about how to introduce the man who delivered her daughter but wasn't technically the child's father. "This is Silas," she said finally, "who's going to love you just as much as I do." Silas reached out to touch the baby's tiny hand, his weathered fingers gentle against her perfect skin. "She's going to need a name," he said softly. "Something that fits a girl who had the courage to be born during a mountain storm." Clara had been thinking about names for months, but none of the options she'd considered seemed adequate for this moment. This child who'd chosen to arrive during their greatest crisis and somehow transformed it into their greatest joy. "Hope," she said suddenly, the name feeling right as soon as she spoke it. "Her name is Hope, because that's what she represents, hope for the future, no matter what challenges we face." "Hope," Silas repeated, smiling at the baby, who was now grasping his finger with surprising strength. "Hope Whitcomb, it's perfect." Outside, the storm was beginning to ease, the thunder moving farther down the valley, and the rain settling into the steady rhythm that would continue for hours, but no longer carried the violence of the earlier downpour. Clara could see glimpses of blue sky through the breaking clouds, promise that the isolation wouldn't last forever. "We should try to get word to the doctor," Clara said, though she felt confident that the birth had gone as well as anyone could hope. "Make sure Hope's healthy and that I don't need any medical attention." "Soon as the creek goes down enough for travel," Silas agreed. "But from what I can see, you both came through this like champions. This little girl's got her mother's strength." Clara felt the truth of that assessment in her bones, the bone-deep satisfaction that came from accomplishing something she'd never imagined she could do. She'd given birth in a storm-bound cabin with no medical assistance, and both she and her daughter had emerged healthy and strong. "Silas," she said, looking up from her daughter's face to meet his eyes, "I need you to know something. What you did today, helping me through this birth, staying calm when everything seemed impossible, that makes you Hope's father in every way that matters." Silas's eyes filled with tears at her words, the recognition of a role he'd hoped for, but hadn't dared claim. Clara, too, don't know what to say. "Say you'll love her like she's your own," Clara said simply. "Say you'll be the father she deserves, regardless of biology or legal technicalities." "I already do love her," Silas said, his voice breaking slightly. "From the moment I saw her face, I knew she was part of my heart. Biology doesn't create family, love does. And I love both of you more than I knew was possible." Hope chose that moment to open her eyes fully, dark blue pupils that seemed to take in both adults with serious consideration. Clara laughed at her daughter's solemn expression, the way she seemed to be evaluating her new family with the gravity of someone making important decisions. "What do you think, Hope?" Clara asked her daughter. "Does Silas pass your inspection?" As if in response, Hope reached toward Silas's voice, her tiny hand opening and closing in the universal infant gesture that seemed to request closer contact. Silas offered his finger again, which Hope grasped with both hands, holding on as if she'd already decided he was worth keeping. "I think that's approval," Clara observed, feeling her heart expand with love for both her daughter and the man who'd become an integral part of their family. "She's got good instincts." As the afternoon progressed, they settled into the rhythms of new parenthood, taking turns holding Hope and marveling at her perfect features. Clara attempted to nurse, discovering that her daughter had inherited her mother's determination along with her strong grip. She knows what she wants, Silas observed, watching Hope's focused concentration during feeding. That's going to serve her well in this family. Clara smiled at the comment, understanding that Hope would indeed need determination to thrive in the uncertain circumstances surrounding her birth. The legal battle with the bank hadn't disappeared, but it had been transformed by the arrival of new life that put everything else in perspective. The foreclosure hearing, Clara said suddenly, remembering their obligation despite the changed circumstances. What happens when we don't show up? Judge Morrison will understand, Silas said confidently. Birth of a child is about the best excuse you can have for missing a court date. We'll reschedule once you and Hope are ready to travel. And the bank, they'll probably claim we're trying to delay proceedings. Let them claim whatever they want. Silas's voice carried new resolve, the confidence of a man who just helped deliver a baby and discovered reserves of strength he hadn't known he possessed. We'll fight them when we're ready, on our terms, with our family intact. Clara felt the rightness of his words, the way their priorities had been clarified by the day's events. The property battle was important, but it wasn't the most important thing. Hope's safe arrival had reminded them what they were really fighting for, not just land or buildings, but the right to create a home where love could flourish. As evening approached, the storm clouds cleared completely, revealing a sunset that painted the valley in shades of gold and purple. Clara sat by the window with Hope in her arms, showing her daughter the beautiful world she'd been born into. "Look, Hope," she murmured, pointing toward the mountains that surrounded their valley. "This is your home. This is the place your papa and I built for you, where you'll grow up surrounded by love and beauty." Silas joined them at the window, his arm around Clara's shoulders, as they watched the sun set over their mountain sanctuary. Despite the uncertainty that surrounded their legal situation, despite the challenges that lay ahead, this moment felt perfect, a family complete, looking toward a future they'd face together. Whatever happens with the bank, with the property, with anything else, Clara said quietly, we have this. We have each other, and we have Hope, and that's more valuable than any piece of paper or legal document. It is, Silas agreed, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of Clara's head. This is what we were really building all along, not just a cabin, but a family. And that can't be foreclosed on or taken away by anyone. Hope stirred in Clara's arms, opening her eyes to look at both her parents with the serious expression that seemed to be her default demeanor. In that moment, looking at their daughter who'd been born into uncertainty but surrounded by love, Clara understood that they'd already won the most important battle of their lives. The family photograph was taken 6 months later, on a crisp autumn morning, when the aspen trees had turned gold and the cabin stood complete against the backdrop of snow-dusted peaks. Clara held Hope, now a bright-eyed baby who smiled readily and reached for everything within her grasp, while Silas stood beside them with his arm around Clara's shoulders and his other hand resting protectively on Hope's back. The photographer, a traveling portrait artist who visited the mountain communities twice yearly, had positioned them beside the completed cabin, with its solid stone walls and sturdy timber roof, creating a backdrop that spoke of permanence and prosperity. The garden Clara had planted showed the remnants of a successful harvest, and the small barn Silas had built during the summer months housed their growing collection of livestock. "Perfect," the photographer declared, adjusting his equipment one final time. "Hold that pose. This is going to be a beautiful portrait of a beautiful family." Clara smiled genuinely for the camera, her happiness radiating from a deep well of contentment that had been filling steadily since Hope's birth. The legal battle with Eastern Mountain Bank had been resolved in their favor, with Judge Morrison ruling that Clara's deed was valid and that the bank's claim was based on fraudulent documentation. The Community Defense Fund had made the difference, providing resources for legal representation that exposed the bank's pattern of questionable foreclosure practices. "I still can't believe we won," Clara said as the photographer packed his equipment. "Sometimes I wake up expecting to find out it was all a dream." "It wasn't a dream," Silas assured her, bouncing Hope gently in his arms. It was justice and community support, and our own stubborn refusal to give up when things looked impossible. The victory had taken months to achieve, with depositions and court hearings that stretched through the summer, while Clara recovered from childbirth and adjusted to motherhood. But the community rallying around their cause had created something larger than individual legal success. It had forged bonds between neighbors that transformed the scattered homesteads into a genuine support network. Mrs. Henderson wants to organize a harvest celebration next month, Clara reported, referring to their neighbor who'd become a close friend during the legal proceedings. She thinks the families who work together on the defense fund should continue meeting regularly. That's a good idea, Silas agreed. Community that can organize to fight legal battles can organize for other purposes, too should resources, emergency assistance, social connection. Clara nodded, understanding how much their experience had changed her perspective on independence and self-reliance. She'd learned that true security came not from isolation, but from being part of a network of people who cared about each other's welfare. Hope gurgled happily in Silas's arms, reaching for the colorful leaves that drifted down from the trees around their cabin. At 6 months old, she was a robust, curious baby who seemed to find everything in her world fascinating and worthy of investigation. "She's going to be walking soon," Clara observed, noting how Hope strained to move toward anything that caught her attention. "And then we'll really have our hands full. Good thing we've got plenty of space for her to explore," Silas said, gesturing toward the valley that spread around their homestead, "and good neighbors to help keep an eye on her when she gets mobile." The cabin had been expanded since Hope's birth, with a proper bedroom added for the baby and a larger kitchen to accommodate their growing household. Silas had moved his belongings from the ranch house after their marriage in late spring, a simple ceremony performed by Judge Morrison with their community friends as witnesses. The marriage had felt natural rather than momentous, a legal recognition of the partnership they'd already established through shared work and mutual commitment. Clara had kept her maiden name professionally, but embraced the role of Silas's wife with the same determination she'd applied to building her cabin. "I've been thinking about expansion," Clara said as they walked toward the house, Hope contentedly settled in Silas's arms. "Not just the cabin, but our operation here. Maybe we could start a small carpentry business, take advantage of the building skills we've both developed." "There's certainly demand for quality construction in the valley," Silas agreed. "And we've got a good reputation after finishing this place. People can see we do solid work." Clara felt excitement building as she considered the possibilities. The legal victory had secured their land ownership, but it had also opened opportunities for economic development that could provide long-term security for their family. "Hope could grow up learning the business," she continued, warming to the vision. "By the time she's old enough to help, we could have established customers throughout the region. Teaching her carpentry and construction would give her skills that will always be valuable," Silas agreed. "And working together as a family business would keep us close as she grows up." Inside the cabin, Clara prepared dinner, while Silas entertained Hope with wooden blocks he'd carved from scraps of their construction lumber. The domestic scene felt both ordinary and miraculous, the daily rhythm of family life that she'd thought was lost forever when Thomas died. "Do you ever miss it?" Silas asked during dinner, perhaps reading her contemplative mood. "The solitude, the independence you had before we got tangled up together?" Clara considered the question seriously, understanding the importance of honest communication in their marriage. "I miss the simplicity sometimes," she admitted. "When decisions only affected me, when I didn't have to consider anyone else's needs or opinions. But I don't miss the loneliness, and I don't miss the burden of handling everything alone." "I know what you mean," Silas said, cutting his meat with the methodical precision that characterized all his actions. "Partnership requires compromise, negotiation, consideration of someone else's perspective. But it also provides support, shared purpose, and the satisfaction of building something larger than either of us could create alone." "Exactly." Clara smiled at his understanding, the way their marriage had become a true partnership of equals rather than traditional roles that constrained either of them. And hope benefits from having two parents who genuinely enjoy each other's company. After dinner, they sat on their completed porch and watched the sun set over the valley that had become their permanent home. Hope played with her wooden blocks on a blanket between them, babbling in the language that only babies understood, but that somehow communicated her contentment clearly. "I keep thinking about that first morning when you helped me with the roof beam," Clara said, remembering the moment when their lives had first intersected meaningfully. "If you hadn't been working that fence line, if you hadn't seen me struggling—" "But I was, and I did," Silas interrupted gently, "and you let me help, despite your fierce independence. Everything that followed grew from that first moment of accepting assistance when you needed it." Clara nodded, understanding how their story had always been about the courage to accept help and offer it in return. The cabin they'd built together was solid and beautiful, but the family they'd created was the real masterpiece's chosen connection that had weathered crisis and emerged stronger. "What do you think Hope will remember about this place?" Clara asked, watching their daughter explore the texture of her wooden blocks with intense concentration. "I think she'll remember that her parents loved each other and worked together to create something good," Silas said. "I think she'll remember that home isn't just a buildings, it's the people who choose to share their lives with you." As darkness settled over the valley, Clara gathered Hope for her evening feeding, while Silas banked the fire and prepared the cabin for night. The routine felt established and comforting, the rhythm of a family that had found its rhythm and settled into the security of mutual commitment. Looking around the cabin they'd built with their own hands, holding the daughter who'd been born into love and determination, Clara felt the deep satisfaction that came from creating something lasting. The legal battle was over, the construction was complete, and their family was thriving in the mountain sanctuary they'd carved from wilderness and hope. "Thank you," she said to Silas as he joined her beside Hope's cradle, the same cradle he'd built months ago as a leap of faith in their future. "For what?" "For seeing the potential in a pregnant woman building alone. For offering help when I needed it most. For becoming the father Hope deserves and the husband I didn't know I was hoping for." Silas kissed her forehead gently, his arms encircling both Clara and their sleeping daughter. "Thank you for letting me become part of what you were building, for trusting me with your dreams and your heart." Outside, the mountain wind carried the promise of winter and the certainty of seasons turning, but inside their solid cabin, surrounded by love and warmed by the life they'd created together, Clara felt the deep peace that came from being exactly where she belonged.